It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. The United Nations Security Council voted 14-1 to rebuke the Trump administration's decision to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. The U.S. was the only country to vote against the resolution, and since the U.S. has a veto on the Security Council, the vote did not pass. Here are some of the proceedings at the Security Council just before the vote took place, and U.S. Ambassador at the UN, Nikki Haley's comments shortly after the vote.
The United States will not be told by any country where we can put our embassy. Buried even deeper in the jargon of this resolution is the accusation that the United States is setting back the prospects of peace in the Middle East. That is a scandalous charge. What we witnessed here today in the Security Council is an insult. It won't be forgotten. It's one more example of the United Nations doing more harm than good in addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today, for the simple act of deciding where to put our embassy, the United States was forced to defend its sovereignty. The record will reflect that we did so proudly.
On to talk about this with me is Vijay Prashad. He's the editor-in-chief of Leftward Books. He's the author of many books, among them The Death of a Nation and The Future of the Arab Revolution. Thanks for joining me, Vijay.
Thanks a lot.
All right, Vijay, let's start with your reaction to Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, her comments we just ran.
Well, it's important to point out that this was a 14-1 vote in the UN Security Council, where staunch American allies, Britain, France, and others, voted against the United States' interest and forced the United States to veto the resolution. There were about 4 positions that the world community took on this matter of shifting the US Embassy to Jerusalem, changing the status, in other words, of Jerusalem unilaterally. The first was, I think, articulated by the Chinese, who said that this is a sensitive issue, in other words, the Israel-Palestine issue, and it should not be inflamed by actions taken by the United States unilaterally. The second, I think, important point made was that this goes against a long history of UN Security Council resolutions, going back to Resolution 252 from 1968, and then again Resolution 476 from 1980, which directly rebuked the Israeli government's attempt to take Jerusalem as its capital. This 1980 resolution in particular was very sharp. This is Resolution 476. The third issue that was raised by the countries, particularly by US allies, United States, France, and others, was the question that Jerusalem is part of the final status negotiations and shouldn't be unilaterally decided upon before the Israelis and Palestinians are further along in their discussion, in their deliberations. And the final issue raised by a number of non-veto wielding powers such as Ethiopia, Senegal, etc., was that Jerusalem is the capital of 3 major religions in the world: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and that no move should be made that prejudices any religion to have access to the holy sites in the city of Jerusalem. So these were the 4, I think, quite principled reasons why the world decided to vote against Donald Trump's action from December 6th. And it's unfortunate that the United States, rather than merely abstaining and allowing this rebuke to go through, decided to veto it. This is, taking on the world and isolating the United States, which may not be a very bad thing in itself, but I think it simply inflames the situation on the ground in Palestine.
Now, Vijay, give us some context to this resolution. How did it come about? Why is the Security Council dealing with it? Who drafted it? Who brought it forward? Given that the United States knew that this resolution would be defeated at the Security Council level, why did they let it come to the floor?
Well, after Mr. Trump made his statement on December 6th, there was already a great deal of despair in the world's capitals, saying that this move is going to make any form of peace negotiations difficult. In fact, even staunch US allies such as Saudi Arabia turned their noses up on this particular action by the Trump administration. For a long time, we haven't seen any unity between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and on this issue, both of them took the same position. So Trump had the the kind of, let us say, the ability to draw together two enemies in the region and make them take the same position against his view. Well, it just turned out that on the council for this sequence was Egypt. And Egypt, again, a close ally of Saudi Arabia, drafted the resolution. I think, it's got to be said that these Arab states are under immense pressure from their populations to not allow any unilateral move by the United States to give Jerusalem, as it were, to Israel. So under immense pressure from its own population, the government of Egypt drafted this resolution. It was backed entirely by most of the Arab states. They are not at the council itself, but they backed this resolution fully. And it didn't take much backdoor diplomacy to get the other members to agree. I mean, as I said, there are sufficient and complex grounds, including the history of the council vis-a-vis Jerusalem, particularly Resolution 476 from 1980, that gave the Egyptian draft resolution a great deal of heft. And I think it was left to Nikki Haley to carry a very poor, very very light brief into the council. And again, I'd like to point out that this council meeting lasted for only an hour and a half. This was not a prolonged session. It started, just after noon, and it ended at about 1:30.
I understand that anything related to Palestine right now is very contentious at the United Nations, and that Palestine is actually proposing to bring this resolution to the floor of the General Assembly since it was defeated at the Security Council because of the U.S. veto power. Now, if it comes to the floor of the General Assembly, do you think it will be defeated there?
Well, it's an entirely political move on the part of the Palestinians, and I think they have every right and perhaps should go to the General Assembly. It's a sort of international referendum on the unilateral action taken by the United States. But I'd like to also point out that, not half an hour after Mr. Trump made his statement on December 6th about moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, he signed the waiver that allows the U.S. Embassy to operate from Tel Aviv. So it appears that even inside the Trump White House, there's incoherence on this. It appears that Mr. Trump enjoys making these spectacular gestures, kicking dust in the eyes of the world, but it doesn't entirely appear that he's being serious about this, because after all, he did sign the waiver, and the U.S. Embassy will continue to function from Tel Aviv.
All right, Vijay, finally, let me still ask you about the viability of this bill at the General Assembly.
I very much doubt that it will be defeated in the General Assembly. I think it will be a majority vote. After all, when resolutions come before the General Assembly on questions of Israel, they run something like 180 or 185 take the position against one of Israel's asymmetric wars, and a handful of countries vote against it. The United States, Israel itself, and one or two other countries, mainly countries in the South Sea Islands that vote with the United States, quite habitually. So I think that will be the kind of vote that we'll see in the General Assembly. It will be an entirely political vote. It's not a binding resolution in any way. It doesn't carry much weight. But it, I think, should, explain to people in the United States that U.S. policy on Israel is utterly out of step with world opinion.
All right, Vijay, as always, I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.